Okay, so let's jump right into just figuring out how to create that same program that we had before running in pure JavaScript in a combination of HTML and JavaScript. And in doing so, I'm going to teach some important concepts about how you can get HTML and JavaScript to interact with each other, because that's going to be part of the probably one of the most difficult things to grasp this semester is how do you get the two, because in essence these are two different languages. How do you get them to share information and pass it back and forth seamlessly between the two? Because we're going to be using our HTML as our input and our output, right? So we're going to get the information from our users in HTML, and then we have to pass that somehow into the JavaScript for processing. And then once the JavaScript is done processing it, it has to pass it back to the HTML to display it to the user. And we're going to do that here. So the first thing, obviously, is we want to start building some HTML elements, some tags, to represent our user interface, or the screen that we want our users to see. And in the same way that we kind of separated our input and our output and our processing in JavaScript, we can do the same thing inside our HTML with the comments that we used before in HTML. Now you notice here all I did was inside the body, kind of like we did with our paragraphs and H1 tags for last week's assignments. I created just some text right in the body, right? I didn't put a paragraph around it or anything because I don't want any formatting on it. I just want it to be straight text followed by an input field, which we talked briefly about, of type text. And the only thing different about this code that you didn't have in the last code that we didn't talk too much about is this ID right here. Now this ID is extremely important because this ID gives my input tag here a name. It gives it a unique name, and that's important that it's unique. You only want to have one ID, so the text in here, the actual name you put in here, you only want to have one of those per page, because it needs to be unique, because it identifies this specific input box, right? So this input box here, what is your first name, has a name, and that name is called fname. Same with this input box here, it has a name called lname. Now that's important, we'll get back to that in a second. So we've got that, and we've got our input, right? We're basically the input here, we're going to put in my first name here and my last name here. And now we want to kind of put some space aside on our HTML page to do some output. And we'll do a similar thing right in here in the body. I've got a comment here to say this is where my output is going to be. And I put these BRs in here. If we didn't talk about those, that's just a line break. That does a return. If I don't have that, then you're it's just formatting thing to make things look nice, right? So we'll keep that in there to make things look nice. And I've done the same thing. I've done your full name here, and then I've used a tag called a span. Now sometimes you may use a div, sometimes you use a span. The nice things about those are they're kind of empty. They don't do anything. They just hold a container, if you will, to put stuff into. And we'll talk about how you put stuff into it in a second. And a span has no formatting around it. If you use a div instead of a span, and it does kind of like a p tag, where anything you put inside of it gets spaces in front of it and after it. And the nice thing about this, if I were to put some text in here, and I'm going to call it this for now, and you'll understand why. So if I were to put some text in here, you notice that it's right after this line here. It's all in the same line. It's in line. If this were to be a div, then it would be on the next line like the p tags did. So just to clarify that. And I'm going to leave that inner HTML in there for now, just so that you could see where this tag was located. So we've got our input and our output, and now we need to do some processing. Now the question is here, how do I get the information I punch into here into JavaScript to do some processing? Now we talked a little bit before about events, right? And the events allow us to make code run when we want the code to run. And in order to do that, if you remember correctly, we used a button to create an event. And we'll go ahead and create a button now. And the button, it's similar to the thing. And I'm going to call this, let's not call this get names. Let's call this just run program. So I'm creating a button that says run program in it. And it's called an onClick method here that calls a function called run program. But we haven't created a function yet called run program. So if I were to run this right now, nothing happens. We would just get errors actually on the page because we would get JavaScript errors saying that this program doesn't exist, or this function, excuse me, doesn't exist. So now we need to create a function called run program, which is going to do our stuff. And we can do that right up here in the script tag. Now one thing here, I'm just going to give you a little bit of best practices. Oftentimes I like to declare all of my variables at the top of my script header that I know that I'm going to use. And I'm just going to set them to empty right now. I know I'm going to use first name, last name, and full name. Those are the same variables we used in the last screenshot. So there they are. I'm going to declare them outside of the function because I want them to be declared right when this page loads the first time, so that these are available to my code afterwards. So that might be a little clearer later on. But so now I have my variables, and I need to create a function. And if we remember correctly, a function we do by saying function, and then we put the name in there. And we said on our button we wanted this to be called run program, right? And then you remember the curly braces are needed. And then, so now what's going to happen, we're not going to get any errors anymore because I have a function now called run program. But it's also not going to do anything because my function is empty. So we need to put in our logic that we had before. Now I'm going to go ahead and copy in the code that I've already written for this, and then we're going to talk a little bit about it because there's going to be some stuff in here that we haven't talked about. And I'm just going to put it inside my function. Now you'll notice that inside my function I've continued to label my stuff with the input, processing, and output, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about it because when I click that, I'm still going to do some inputs. I'm going to do some processing, and I'm going to have some output inside my JavaScript, and these inputs and this output is going to be kind of tied to my input and outputs in the HTML. And you'll notice that I have an input in both. Okay, like I mentioned, these are two different programming languages here, and so they've got elements of in the whole defining table in each, and we'll talk about that now. So basically what happens, we're going to run this program. We are going to do similar to what we did before, but instead of doing a prompt here, we're going to call a method called the getElementById, and you always call it by invoking this thing this way, saying document.getElementById. And here's where the ID comes into play. So the ID basically references the ID that we gave this HTML element before, this HTML tag. And so when we say I want JavaScript, when I'm in JavaScript and I say go get the element called fname, right? So it goes into the HTML from the JavaScript and looks for a tag that's called fname. And in this case, here it is. And it will save that here. Now we're going to take it a little bit further because you notice I've got this dot value. And we're not going to go into too much detail about all this, the dot. Just kind of go along with us right now and know that this works. If I were to take this off, right, and just say first name equals this, right, what this is going to do is going to grab the whole tag, every last bit of it, and save it into this variable. Now there's a lot associated with this tag that we're not going to go into this semester, but it has elements about it like size and shape and color and, well, whatever, lots of different attributes associated with this tag that we're not going to really get into. And all those attributes get saved into the first name field. And we don't want all of those. We just want the attribute called .value, which means whatever is typed into here. So if we were to run this right now with these empty, the value of these is nothing. There's nothing in there. But if I type something in there and then run this .value command, it will pull whatever's in there and save it in there. So the value of a input tag is what's inside. Okay? Hope that makes sense. So if it doesn't make sense, then come to office hours and we can talk about it a little bit more. So this code so far, the input, when each line runs, we're going to go get the element called fname find the value of that element, that HTML, and save it into first name. And then we're going to do the same thing with last name. So basically, whatever we put in here and whatever we put in here will get saved into these two variables. Now this next line you'll notice is identical to what we had before. Nothing's changed because once we have it inside of JavaScript and in the variables we want, then it's just, you just run JavaScript. Then you do your processing on what you need to do. And now we're to the point where we want to save this information back into the HTML for people to see, right? And we use the exact same command, the get element by ID, right? But this time we're going to reference a different attribute. So in this case, we're saying, okay, I want you to go out to find the my output HTML tag or element. So it's going to come into the HTML. The JavaScript's going to check the HTML out, and it's going to look for something. Oh, here it is. Here's an ID of my output. So those match. The JavaScript's going to say, okay, I want you to reference the inner HTML attribute, right? And that is the special name for whatever is in the middle of the tag. And I put this in there so that you would know that things between the closing and the opening tag is called the inner HTML. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that now because you could have anything you wanted in there. It doesn't need to be called inner HTML. Basically, we don't have any information in there, so we want it to be blank, right? Your full name is. And then so it's going to take that information, it's going to get the inner HTML, and it's going to save into the inner HTML, or in other words, it's going to put right in the middle of these two tags whatever information was saved in full name. So just to recap here, when we click the button, it's going to run the function called run program, which is going to jump into the JavaScript, and it's going to save into the first name the value of this thing, which is called fname, and then it's going to save in the last name this thing, which is called lname. Remember IDs down here. It's going to process it and create this new concatenated version of just first name and last name. And, well, I guess I said this was the same. You notice we got rid of the hello because now we've got a label up here that we don't, we're just going to say your full name is. And then we're going to do our output, which is going to save whatever the concatenation here out into this span element. It's going to put it right in the inner HTML of that span element. Okay, well, let's see if it works. Cross our fingers because this is a demo. Odds are something will break in a demo. Let's see, run program. There it is, Daniel Wells. Your full name is Daniel Wells. And so there you have it. That kind of shows you how to do the exact same thing we did before, but do it with our HTML and JavaScript. Now, you may be looking at this point and say, this was way harder than doing it the other way. And while that's true, it's also the right way to do things, and it's going to be extremely powerful once these concepts truly just sink in, and you'll realize that you can make your web pages really dynamic and do lots of fun stuff with changing them on the fly and changing bits and pieces here and there with JavaScript as different things happen. All of the neat things that you see on the web. Where you're typing in something and it's automatically checking, for example, a password or a username and saying that password is already, this password is weak, or that username has already been taken. All those things are made enabled because of these interactions that you're seeing right here. So they're very powerful, and I recommend you take the time to get to understand them. If these concepts are really confusing and you're really struggling with these, I highly encourage you to come to office hours because these concepts are going to kind of be the core of everything we do the rest of the semester. Everything is going to build on top of these, and if you don't understand these concepts, it won't. It'll make it hard to learn all of the other things that we're going to be building on top of this. So here's the basic input, processing, and output that you're going to be doing this semester, and I hope that you have a fun week this week.